Before anything like manifestation enters the conversation, there is something quieter that usually goes unnoticed, something you may have felt long before you had language for it. The sense that your inner movements never quite stop at the edges of your skin. You think a thought, feel a pull, hold an intention, and somewhere beyond immediate cause and effect, something subtly rearranges. Not dramatically, not on command, but detectably. For a long time, we were taught to treat consciousness as a private room sealed off from the rest of the world, where thoughts echoed but never traveled. Yet lived experience keeps contradicting that story. Moments of shared emotion arise without coordination. Collective moods sweep through communities without permission. Entire cultures shift direction without a single author. What if those weren't coincidences at all, but symptoms of an underlying structure? When you look closely, intention behaves less like a personal possession and more like a signal moving through a system already humming with other signals. Your focus doesn't originate in isolation. It enters a field already shaped by countless others past and present, near and distant. This is where the idea of an entangled web becomes less metaphor and more orientation. Not a mystical claim, but a way of noticing how influence actually moves. Every intention subtly influences the conditions it enters, while being influenced in return. You may notice this when your clarity strengthens in certain environments and dissolves in others. When alignment feels effortless around some people and strained around others. When a shared focus suddenly makes things feel possible that once felt immovable. None of this requires belief, only recognition. The universe, at least as we encounter it, behaves less like a collection of separate actors and more like a single responsive system. And within that system, intention is never solitary, it is relational. That recognition alone changes how you listen to your own inner movements. Once you sense that intention doesn't remain contained, a different kind of curiosity naturally arises, not about belief, but about mechanism. Not how to use it, but how this togetherness seems to operate at all. Physics surprisingly ran into this same question long before consciousness entered the conversation. In trying to understand the smallest units of matter, researchers noticed something deeply unsettling to classical logic. Particles once connected continued to behave as a single system, even when separated by vast distance. A change here was reflected there, instantly. This became known almost nervously as spooky action at a distance, not because it was mystical, but because it refused to behave like anything isolated. The particles did not send signals back and forth. They didn't travel. They simply responded as if distance had lost relevance. What matters here is not the math, it's the pattern. Entanglement suggests that once systems interact deeply enough, they no longer function as independent units. They become relational expressions of a shared state, separate in appearance, unified in behavior. You may notice how familiar that feels. Think of moments when you knew someone was about to call, when collective tension rose before an event without explanation, when grief, hope, or urgency spread faster than information ever could. These aren't proofs. They are echoes. Entanglement offers a soft framework for understanding why separation often feels thinner than we're taught to expect. Why connection persists even when contact disappears. Why influence doesn't seem to respect physical boundaries. This doesn't mean humans are particles. It means patterns repeat across scales. Systems that share history tend to share response. Systems that interact meaningfully remain linked through the field they've altered together. You are not floating independently through reality. You are moving within networks of relationship memory and resonance, many of which operate beneath conscious awareness. This reframes human interconnectedness from sentiment into structure, from poetry into pattern. When people speak of vibes, energy, or collective mood, They're often pointing toward this same intuition without vocabulary, a sense that something invisible but real is coordinating experience. Entanglement doesn't tell you what to think. It simply removes the assumption that influence must travel locally, linearly, or alone. And once that assumption loosens, another question quietly forms. If matter itself remains linked beyond distance, what does that suggest about awareness, which is far less confined than matter ever was? That question doesn't demand an answer yet. It just widens the frame, because the more closely you look, the more separation begins to feel like a useful illusion rather than a final truth. If separation has begun to feel thinner, then the next tension isn't theoretical, it's personal, because the question quietly turns toward where awareness itself actually lives. For most of your life, you were likely taught to locate consciousness inside the skull, as a byproduct of neural activity contained private and fundamentally local. Thoughts begin here. Experience ends here. Yet that explanation has always struggled to account for something simple and undeniable. Awareness doesn't feel confined. You don't experience perception as something bouncing around inside your head. You experience it as something meeting the world. Sound arrives fully formed. Meaning appears whole. Connection registers before analysis ever catches up. From this perspective, consciousness behaves less like a generator and more like a receiver and transmitter within a larger system, not producing reality, but participating in it. This is where the idea of consciousness as a quantum field begins to function less as speculation and more as orientation. Not a claim that the mind is magical, but that awareness may be embedded within a non-local structure just as matter appears to be. In this framing, your mind isn't isolated hardware, it's a node, a point of interaction where the field becomes personal, embodied, and responsive. Your nervous system tunes, your attention selects, your state modulates what registers clearly and what dissolves into noise. You may notice this when your internal coherence shifts your external experience without any deliberate effort, when calm reorganizes perception, when anxiety fragments it, when shared focus suddenly sharpens group awareness as if everyone is listening to the same signal. These moments don't require belief. They require noticing. If awareness is participatory, then consciousness doesn't merely observe reality collapsing into form. It subtly conditions which patterns stabilize in the first place. This doesn't make you the center of the universe. It places you within it. Your attention becomes one strand among many, influencing and being influenced simultaneously. Your inner state contributes to the informational texture of the field, just as other states contribute to yours. This reframes intention again, not as force, not as demand, but as signal quality. Clear signals resonate, fragmented signals interfere. Coherent states align more easily with other coherent states, not by control, but by compatibility. You may already sense where this leads. If consciousness operates as a network rather than a container, then individual intention was never meant to act alone. It was always meant to couple, to synchronize, to find rhythm with other signals already moving. And once intention is understood as signal, another layer quietly reveals itself. Signals don't just exist, they ripple. They extend beyond their point of origin, subtly shaping the probability landscape they pass through. By the time intention is understood as signal, something important has already changed in how effort is perceived. The question is no longer whether your focus matters, but how it interacts with everything already in motion. A signal does not impose itself on a system, it enters it. And when a signal carries clarity, steadiness, and coherence, it doesn't need to push, it resonates. This is the subtle mechanics behind what is often called the ripple effect, though ripple is almost too dramatic a word. Most of the time, influence moves quietly. It reorganizes probability rather than forcing outcomes. You may notice this when a single grounded presence shifts the tone of an entire room without saying a word. When one person's regulated nervous system calms others automatically. When shared clarity makes solutions appear that weren't accessible before. None of that requires intention to be amplified through willpower. It requires alignment. In a relational system, coherence attracts coherence. Signals that carry internal consistency tend to synchronize more easily with other consistent signals, not because they dominate, but because they fit. This is where manifestation, when viewed collectively, stops looking like desire and starts looking like pattern formation. A field with enough aligned signals begins to stabilize certain outcomes over others. Not guaranteed, not instant, but noticeably. From this angle, individual focus matters precisely because it is small. Small enough to integrate without resistance, small enough to influence without disruption. A fragmented signal adds noise. A coherent one reduces it. When many individuals settle into similar states of clarity, the system doesn't feel forced. It feels organized, as if something latent has finally found the conditions it needed to emerge. This isn't about everyone thinking the same thought. It's about many people holding compatible states. States of openness tend to invite possibility. States of fear tend to contract it. States of coherence make pathways easier to detect. You may sense how different this feels from trying to make something happen. The effort shifts from exertion to attunement. And this is where collective manifestation begins to look less like a miracle and more like a natural consequence of resonance. When signals align, they reinforce one another. When they conflict, they cancel. This doesn't remove individual agency, it contextualizes it. Your role isn't to overpower the field. It's to contribute a signal that can actually be received. And once that signal enters, it doesn't stay local, it interacts. It couples, it subtly reorganizes what becomes more likely next, which raises a quieter, more interesting implication. If aligned signals can influence a system without proximity, then distance itself may not be the barrier we assume it is. Distance tends to feel important until you notice how often it fails to matter, not metaphorically but experientially in ways you've likely dismissed because there was no framework to hold them. Something happens across space, and you feel it anyway. In classical thinking, influence requires contact or transmission. A signal must travel, time must pass, cause must precede effect in neat sequence. But in an entangled system, those rules soften. What matters isn't where something is, but whether it is already connected within the same informational structure. This is where non-local influence stops sounding abstract and starts sounding familiar, because shared intention doesn't need coordination to function. It needs coherence. When multiple individuals hold compatible states, not identical thoughts, but resonant orientations, something stabilizes between them. A shared pattern begins to form in the field they're participating in. You don't need to know each other. You don't need to agree on language. You don't even need to be aware that alignment is happening. The field doesn't require permission. It responds to condition. You may notice this during moments when collective attention converges naturally. Global events, cultural turning points, periods where many people independently sense that something is ending or beginning even before evidence appears. These moments often arrive with an unusual density of synchronicity, parallel insights, and overlapping realizations. Not because information is spreading faster, but because awareness is tuning similarly across many nodes at once. From within this lens, collective intention behaves less like a broadcast and more like phase alignment. When enough signals synchronize, interference drops. Pathways that were previously improbable become easier to occupy. This doesn't violate individuality, it preserves it. Each node contributes differently. Each perspective adds texture, but the underlying state becomes shared. Non-locality doesn't mean everything affects everything equally. It means influence moves through relationship, not space. A coherent signal can be registered wherever the system is receptive. A fragmented one dissipates no matter how loudly it's projected. You may notice how this reframes the idea of reach. Impact isn't about visibility, it's about resonance. A quiet, steady alignment held by many can outweigh a dramatic effort held by few, not through force, but through compatibility with the field's existing tendencies. And this brings us to a different way of visualizing reality itself. If influence doesn't travel outward from a center but emerges from shared conditions, then reality may not be something happening to us individually at all. It may be something we are continuously collectively projecting, moment by moment, from within the same responsive structure. That realization doesn't ask you to do anything. It asks you to see differently, because once perception shifts, participation follows naturally. At a certain point, the question stops being how influence moves and becomes something quieter and more unsettling. What exactly is the surface it's moving across? Because if intention doesn't travel outward in straight lines, and if awareness doesn't sit neatly inside individual bodies, then reality itself may not be the solid backdrop we were trained to assume. It may be something more responsive, more participatory. This is where the image of a holographic universe begins to feel less like science fiction and more like an honest metaphor. In a hologram, every part contains information about the whole, and the whole only appears coherent when the underlying pattern is stable. Nothing exists independently. Everything contributes. From this perspective, what you experience as the world isn't a fixed object you're moving through. It's a continuously refreshed projection arising from the total informational state of the system. Your perceptions, interpretations, and expectations don't create it alone, but they help determine how it resolves. You are not painting the canvas by yourself. You are adding brushstrokes to a surface already layered with others. This helps explain why reality often feels consistent until it doesn't. Why long-standing structures suddenly collapse. Why new norms appear almost overnight, as if consensus shifted faster than causality should allow. What changed wasn't the physical substrate first. It was the shared internal orientation. When enough nodes in a system update their expectations, fears, or values, the projection reorganizes to match. Not because reality obeys thought, but because reality reflects coherence. You may notice this in smaller ways too, when a group's unspoken agreement shapes what feels possible. When collective belief stabilizes a pattern long after it stops making sense. When a subtle internal shift makes an external environment feel unfamiliar without any visible change. The holographic view doesn't deny material reality. It contextualizes it. Matter becomes the crystallized edge of information. Events become expressions of underlying states. Structures become habits that persisted long enough to feel permanent. And because the projection is shared, no single participant controls it. But every participant influences the resolution. This reframes responsibility without inflating importance. You matter, but not as a solitary architect. You matter as a contributor to tone, texture, and stability. Your inner state becomes relevant not because it commands outcomes, but because it participates in pattern formation. Coherent states tend to reinforce coherence already present. Fragmented states amplify fragmentation. This is why attempts to force collective change often fail. They operate at the level of surface action while ignoring the deeper informational field that determines what can hold. Change that lasts tends to arrive when internal states align quietly. First, when perception shifts before policy, when values reorganize before structures. From within this lens, manifestation stops being about acquisition and starts being about contribution. What kind of signal are you adding to the projection, not morally, energetically? Are you reinforcing fear, urgency, and separation even unintentionally? Or are you adding clarity, steadiness, and openness that others can synchronize with? This isn't a demand for perfection. It's an invitation to notice participation. The hologram doesn't punish incoherence. It reflects it. And it doesn't reward alignment either. It stabilizes it, which means the more people sense this participatory role, the more subtle shifts begin to appear, not as miracles, but as pattern adjustments. Reality starts responding differently, not because anyone is controlling it, but because the conditions feeding it have changed. That recognition sets the stage for something even more tangible, because once you see reality as responsive, you begin to notice when it answers back. After perception adjusts to reality as participatory, something subtle but persistent begins to surface. You start noticing responses, not answers in words, not confirmations carved in certainty, but patterns that feel strangely timed, layered, and coordinated beyond personal intention. This is often where synchronicity enters experience, not as spectacle, but as signal. Meaningful coincidence isn't meaningful because it proves anything. It's meaningful because it carries coherence. Events align not perfectly, but relevantly. Inner states and outer circumstances echo one another with just enough precision to be noticed and just enough ambiguity to remain open. Within an entangled system, synchronicity functions less like a message and more like feedback. It reflects the degree of alignment between internal orientation and collective conditions. When coherence increases, patterns become easier to detect. You may notice this when shared focus accelerates discovery. Multiple people arrive at similar insights independently. Breakthroughs emerge simultaneously across different fields, cultures, or locations without clear lines of influence. These moments aren't random. They're coordinated, not through planning, but through shared readiness. Collective healing offers another lens. When groups gather with regulated presence and common intention, outcomes sometimes appear that feel disproportionate to effort. Pain softens, conflict loosens, resolution becomes imaginable where it once wasn't. What matters here isn't outcome, but condition. The group's nervous systems settle into compatibility. Attention synchronizes, noise drops. From within the field, this coherence registers as availability. Possibilities that were previously unstable find enough support to take form. You don't need to romanticize this. Many cultures have recognized versions of it long before modern language existed. What's different now is the emerging ability to describe it without collapsing into belief or dismissal. Concepts like the morphogenetic field attempted this bridge. The idea that patterns of behavior, form, and organization are stored non-locally and accessed collectively, that once a pattern stabilizes somewhere, it becomes easier to replicate elsewhere. Whether or not the terminology holds, the intuition persists. Systems remember. Once a collective learns something at the level of state, not information, it rarely returns fully to its previous configuration. The field updates. Baseline shifts. You can sense this in cultural turning points, moments when something becomes unacceptable almost overnight, when new values spread without enforcement, when old narratives lose their grip without being defeated. These shifts don't begin with argument, they begin with recognition. Enough individuals feel the same internal mismatch with the old pattern, and coherence dissolves it quietly. A new configuration doesn't arrive fully formed. It stabilizes gradually through repetition and shared reinforcement. Synchronicity often clusters around these thresholds. It's not announcing change, it's accompanying it. You may notice how during periods of collective stress or awakening, coincidence increases. Dreams overlap, language converges, questions repeat across unrelated conversations. This isn't the universe whispering secrets. It's the system reorganizing and producing echoes as alignment fluctuates. When coherence rises, feedback becomes more visible. When fragmentation dominates, feedback becomes chaotic or overwhelming. Neither is moral. Both are informational. This reframes how evidence is interpreted. Instead of asking whether something proves manifestation, the more useful inquiry becomes, what condition does this reflect? Synchronicity doesn't reward intention. It mirrors coherence. Collective breakthroughs don't arrive because effort peaks. They arrive because enough internal states converge to support a new pattern. And once you recognize these responses as feedback rather than signs, something softens. Urgency fades. Listening deepens. You stop trying to extract meaning and start noticing relationship between inner state and outer pattern, between individual presence and collective movement. This noticing isn't passive. It subtly adjusts how you participate. Because when feedback is recognized, signals naturally refine. Noise decreases without force, and from that refinement, a question begins to form not about possibility, but about responsibility. If coherence shapes what becomes easier to manifest collectively, then how individual alignment contributes begins to matter in a new way, not as pressure, as participation. By the time responsibility enters awareness, it doesn't arrive as weight. It arrives as sensitivity, a sense that how you show up matters not symbolically but structurally, because coherence doesn't begin in thought. It begins in the body. Groups don't synchronize through ideas alone. They synchronize through regulation, through breathing patterns, pacing, tone, and the unspoken signals nervous systems exchange continuously. You've felt this before entering a room. The atmosphere registers before conversation starts. Safety or tension is detected instantly, long before anyone explains themselves. When groups gather with shared intention, what determines impact isn't how strongly they want something, but how compatible their internal states are. Agitation fragments the signal. Presence stabilizes it. This is why collective practices across cultures have always emphasized settling before focusing, not as ritual but as necessity. A dysregulated system cannot hold a coherent pattern for long. When individuals arrive regulated enough to remain open without collapse, something shifts between them. Attention begins to synchronize naturally. Listening deepens without effort. This is coherence in action. From within the field, these moments register as availability, not demand, not force, availability. Possibilities that require collective support find a stable surface to land on. Outcomes that once felt unreachable suddenly feel obvious, even inevitable in hindsight. What's often described as group power is really the absence of interference. Less noise, less internal contradiction. You may notice that the most effective collective moments don't feel intense. They feel clear, calm, almost ordinary. Breakthroughs emerge quietly. Healing unfolds without drama. Solutions surface without anyone needing to claim credit. This is because coherence doesn't amplify ego. It dissolves it temporarily, not by suppression but by irrelevance. When the system stabilizes, individual urgency loses its grip. From this lens, practices like meditation or visualization aren't techniques for manifestation. They're environments for alignment. They provide conditions where individual signals can settle enough to find compatibility with others, where shared attention becomes possible without coercion. You don't need everyone to participate consciously. Coherence spreads through proximity and resonance, not instruction. A few regulated systems can entrain many dysregulated ones, not by fixing them, but by offering stability the system can organize around. This is why collective healing can ripple outward beyond the participants themselves. Families shift, communities soften, Conversations change tone without explanation. The field updates locally, then propagates. None of this guarantees outcomes. It increases capacity. Capacity for complexity, capacity for adaptation, capacity for holding change without collapse. And this is where amplification truly lives, not in intensity, but in sustainability. A coherent collective can hold intention over time without burnout, without urgency, without fracture. That continuity matters more than force ever could, because reality doesn't respond to spikes. It responds to stability. Patterns that persist tend to shape the projection more reliably than patterns that flare and vanish. Consistency becomes influence. This reframes effort again. The question shifts from how much energy are we putting in to how stable is the state we're holding together. When individual alignment contributes to collective coherence, impact scales naturally, not upward but outward. And as that outward influence grows, another feedback loop quietly activates. Recognition strengthens alignment. Alignment stabilizes coherence. Coherence makes change easier to hold. Which brings us to the final layer before the future comes into view. Because once coherence becomes self-reinforcing, the system begins to teach itself. And at that point, intention is no longer something you aim. It's something you embody. Once coherence sustains itself, something subtle but decisive happens. Effort stops being the driver and recognition quietly takes over. You begin to notice that intention clarifies not through repetition, but through honesty, not by amplifying desire, but by refining signal quality. At the individual level, this doesn't look dramatic. It looks like awareness tightening its focus without tension, like noticing when your internal state is aligned and when it isn't, without judgment. Because clarity isn't something you manufacture. It emerges when conflicting signals settle. You may sense this when an intention suddenly feels simpler, not smaller, but cleaner, less entangled with urgency, fear, or self-justification. That refinement matters. A clear signal integrates more easily into a collective system. It doesn't need to dominate attention. It stabilizes quietly, offering something others can resonate with. This is how amplification actually occurs. Not through pushing intention outward, but through removing internal distortion that prevents resonance. When many individuals do this simultaneously, even unknowingly, collective coherence strengthens without coordination. The system begins to reinforce itself. You may notice that once a collective shift starts, acknowledgement accelerates it. People recognize the change in each other. Language adapts. Behavior follows. This is the feedback loop of reality in motion. Recognition doesn't create change. It stabilizes it. When a shift is seen, named, or simply felt, it becomes easier for others to align with it. Not because they're persuaded, but because the pattern becomes legible. This is why movements often feel inevitable only after they've already begun. Before recognition, they feel improbable. After recognition, they feel obvious. The system reorganizes around what has become visible. At the individual level, this means your role isn't to convince others of coherence. It's to embody it clearly enough that it registers. Your nervous system becomes a tuning fork. Your attention becomes an invitation, not an instruction, an invitation. When enough invitations are present, the collective doesn't need direction. It self-organizes. This reframes responsibility yet again, not as obligation, but as stewardship of state. What you sustain internally contributes to what becomes sustainable externally. What you normalize within yourself becomes easier for others to access. This isn't about perfection. Fluctuation is natural. What matters is return. How quickly coherence can be reestablished after disruption. How gently alignment can be restored without force. As this capacity grows collectively, manifestation becomes less event-based and more atmospheric. Reality begins to feel different before it looks different. Tension reduces, dialogue opens. Dialogue, possibility feels closer to the surface. You may notice that outcomes no longer feel separate from process. They emerge from it. This is the quiet power of collective alignment. It doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself through ease. And as this ease spreads, attention naturally turns outward toward something larger than personal intention, toward the kind of future these patterns are already shaping, not someday, already. Which brings us to the final threshold. Because once enough people sense their participation in the system, the question shifts again. From what can we create to what are we becoming together? At this point, the conversation naturally outgrows personal intention, not because individual experience stops mattering, but because it is finally seen in proportion. What begins to surface is a quieter recognition that every state you hold participates in something larger than your own timeline. This isn't about responsibility in the moral sense, it's about consequence in the structural sense. In an entangled system, coherence accumulates. So does fragmentation. Neither is punished, neither is rewarded. Both simply propagate. This is where the idea of interconnectedness stops being comforting and starts being clarifying. Because if reality is continuously shaped by shared states, then participation is unavoidable. Opting out isn't an option. Only the quality of participation varies. You may notice how this reframes the idea of contribution. It's no longer about fixing the world or carrying its weight. It's about recognizing how subtle internal patterns scale outward over time. Fear doesn't just affect you, it tightens the system. Urgency doesn't just motivate action, it destabilizes coherence. Likewise, steadiness doesn't just calm the individual, it provides structural support others can orient around. This is the responsibility of interconnectedness. Not control, not sacrifice, presence. Your state either adds friction or reduces it. It either reinforces fragmentation or makes coherence easier to maintain. This doesn't mean you must remain regulated at all times. Fluctuation is part of any living system. What matters is whether fragmentation becomes habitual or whether return remains possible. In collective terms, decoherence isn't failure, it's interruption. When attention scatters, when fear dominates, when identity hardens, the system loses flexibility. Possibilities narrow, change becomes brittle. When coherence is restored, even partially, adaptability returns. Dialogue opens. New pathways stabilize. This is why the future isn't something that suddenly arrives. It's something that gradually becomes easier or harder to access, based on accumulated states. The idea of a new paradigm doesn't require prediction. It requires noticing trend lines. Across cultures, disciplines, and communities, there is a growing sensitivity to interdependence, not as ideology, but as lived reality. Systems thinking replaces individual heroics. Regulation becomes more valued than intensity. By 2026 and beyond, this shift won't be defined by technology alone. It will be defined by how well collective nervous systems can tolerate complexity without collapsing into reactivity. That capacity determines what kind of futures can be held, not imagined, held. A fragmented collective struggles to sustain long-term change. A coherent one adapts without tearing itself apart. This is the dawn of the paradigm being sensed, not mystical, practical. A recognition that consciousness participates in reality, not as command but as condition. That shared states quietly shape what becomes feasible. And within this understanding, manifestation stops being about getting. It becomes about belonging. Belonging to the system, belonging to the moment, belonging to the responsibility of presence. You don't need to rush toward this future. You are already contributing to it. Every time coherence is chosen over contraction, every time attention returns instead of hardening, every time participation feels relational rather than adversarial, the future is not waiting to be created. It is continuously being stabilized. Together, when that recognition lands, something settles. Not certainty, but orientation. And that is enough to begin the wind down, where effort dissolves completely and what remains is quiet participation in what is already unfolding. By now, there is nothing left to add, only something to settle into. Not a conclusion, but a tone that lingers after understanding stops reaching for itself. A sense that what matters most was never about doing more, knowing more, or holding tighter. It was about noticing where you already are. When the idea of collective manifestation softens, what remains is quieter than expectation. You may feel less inclined to project forward and more inclined to stay present with what is already coherent. Not because the future disappears, but because it no longer needs to be chased. Recognition has a grounding effect. You begin to sense that participation is constant, whether named or not, that every inner state is already in relationship with others, that nothing needs to be forced for influence to occur. This isn't resignation, it's relief. Relief from the pressure to steer outcomes. Relief from the assumption that impact requires intensity. Relief from the belief that you are separate from the systems you move within. From here, coherence doesn't feel like an achievement. It feels like a return to regulated presence, to listening before reacting, to contributing stability rather than noise. You may notice how this orientation subtly changes how you engage with the world. Conversations slow, decisions feel less reactive. Attention becomes less scattered, not because you're controlling it, but because it has somewhere to rest. This is where embodiment completes the arc, not as technique, as condition. Your body becomes the place where participation is felt rather than conceptualized, where alignment is sensed rather than argued for, where coherence is lived quietly moment by moment. Nothing here promises outcomes, nothing guarantees direction. But something does become clearer. That collective change doesn't begin when everyone agrees. It begins when enough people regulate, recognize, and return. Again and again, the field doesn't need perfect signals. It responds to honest ones. And honesty often looks like simplicity, like staying with what is actually present, like allowing alignment to be enough for now. You don't need to hold the whole system. You are already held within it. Participation continues whether you name it or not. The only variable is how it feels from the inside. So if something in you has softened, that is sufficient. If something has clarified, that is enough. The rest unfolds the way systems always do, gradually, relationally, together. And from here, there is nothing left to do but remain available to the subtle shifts as they arrive, knowing that recognition itself was always the catalyst.